Now, we all thought that Hitler became the leader of the German people and waged war on the world because he was not recognised by the Academy as a great artist. Lee Capel will be in Adelaide to talk to the Australian Decorative and Fine Arts Society and explain that there's much more to the story than that. So thank you for taking time to talk to Kaleidoscope, Lee.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I understand that Hitler's approach to his art was out of step with the rise of modern art. And did he ever come to see the value of modern art movement?
Look, I think there was an aspect of Hitler that he did see the value of modern art for monetary reasons, but otherwise for cultural reasons. No, he was very much against it because of his upbringing with classical art and his influence from growing up around classical artists. So it was something that when modern art came in, it was against the cultural, political and social values that he was aspiring to for a new Germany.
I presume you've seen some samples of his painting. How good was he? Or was he dreadful?
Well, they're easy to show bias because anything associated with Nazis and the Third Reich, it's easy to look at it and say, oh, it's not very good. But if you look on it purely from artistic merits, he was actually a very, very good draftsman. He was very well trained, and because of his background at school studying artists that were draftsmen or architectural studies, he was able to do very good attempts at architectural studies and landscapes, and so they are quite accessible. And when he was in Vienna and he applied for a position in the Vienna Academy of Art, he was rejected from the painting school, but he was actually given the opportunity to go into the architecture school to become a draftsman, and he rejected that. And so he ended up going out on his own and being an amateur artist. And ironically, it was the Jewish community that actually bought a lot of his artworks that were done just after he was rejected from the Vienna Academy prior to World War I. So he definitely had an allure. Obviously, that turned into something a little different once he got involved in politics.
So he never really lost his interest in art, did he?
No, he didn't. And that sort of dragged through into the years preceding World War II, when he went on his plundering and pillaging of cultural treasures and paintings as he aspired to create his own museum in his hometown of Linz to show off his cultural taste, but also to assert power and influence on society.
So, Lee, how did you become interested in this aspect of German art?
Well, it has to be the darkest period in world history. A lot of people just talk about, Hitler and his political conquest and the Holocaust. Although, it is the most important aspect of World War II, not many people talk about his motives, some of his ulterior motives to do with culture and art. And so if you look back at being a rejected artist and wanting to become a professional artist, and you look at his conquest in plundering art from different countries, you get an idea of how much art and culture did mean to Hitler. And I think that's the fascinating part, is because he did have quite a good artistic taste. However, he was clouded by his own personal beliefs, and with art is very subjective, so it's interesting to see how artists associated with Hitler now are seen as less valuable, yet they were lauded in their time, and how artists that Hitler called degenerate art have now shot up in value and importance. So that difference in value is changing. That's a very interesting part of this topic, and why it's interesting to talk about Hitler's influence not only on culture and politics, but also on the art world, which was significant as well.
So have you had the chance to go to Germany and look at examples of what he liked, the ones that he put forward, and then compare it to the others that are now considered better artists?
Absolutely, and I think in Germany now they've got a real interest in displaying a lot of these works. They regularly hold degenerate art exhibitions, not only in Germany but elsewhere around the world, and there are quite a number of works that have been rediscovered or that were originally plundered that are now on display that are out there being exhibited. But not so much the artists that Hitler appreciated and displayed in his great German exhibition in 1937, which was a regular annual exhibition he had up through World War II, to show his own favourites. So a lot of the artworks that were associated with him aren't so displayed or known about. And that's something I'll be going into, because as an art collector, I go out and I seek artworks not only by artists that were degenerate artists that Hitler despised, but also artists that Hitler loved. And I've got quite a collection, and I focus a lot on artworks that are in my own collection by artists that were associated with Hitler, but for no fault of their own have lost value, because a lot of these artists predated the Third Reich. So, how were they to know that Hitler would use their art for his own political means?
It seems most unfair, doesn't it?
It does.
Were there any artists that he actually persecuted to the extent that they had to leave Germany?
Absolutely. There were quite a few, and especially the German expressionists. So you had George Gross. He got exiled. He basically fled to America. There was a few others there, but one that stands out is Emil Nolde. He basically moved to, I believe it was Scandinavia, and the Nazi officers used to regularly check on him. They used to send in officers to make sure that he wasn't painting anymore. And so what he did to offset that, because he couldn't repress his own artistic drive, he changed from using oil paints to watercolours, because watercolours don't have a scent. And so when the Nazi officers would come into his home, they wouldn't smell the paint, so he could hide a lot of his artwork. So that was just one example of how the Nazi regime was suppressing artists and creativity. But also what was most sad about that situation was because Nolde was one of the first artists who committed to the Nazi Party, one of the earliest members, not only earliest artists, but earliest members of the Nazi Party, and they turned their back on him once they recognised that his artwork was against their beliefs.
So loyalty had no value for him. He wasn't appreciated.
The thing about the Third Reich and the Holocaust and Hitler is the hypocrisy that was scattered throughout. You know, Nazi officers would collect modern art for their own gain, for investment purposes, because they realised that modern art was going up in value and it appealed to the people. But also they were saying that this artwork, you know, is not useful, and yet they were collecting it themselves and also selling it off in order to raise money for the movement. So World War II, the Holocaust, the Third Reich, Hitler, it's all hypocrisy, and I will talk about that a lot and the connections that it comes back to with the art. And it's a fascinating topic for that reason alone.
I was just thinking of these Germans inviting Hitler around for afternoon tea or coffee and cake and hiding their modern painting and bringing out the other one so he would be impressed. I wonder if that really happened.
Exactly.
Was it?
Well, I'm sure there would have been quite a few situations where they had the modern art on display because, as I said, art is subjective. And for Hitler to come in and say, well, you should only look at this art, well, some of the Nazi officers definitely wouldn't have just appealed to that closed-minded taste, because I'm sure many of them loved artists like Picasso and Matisse and those artists that were basically not so much exiles but destroyed. A lot of artworks were destroyed during that period, and I'll talk about some of the most important ones that were destroyed. But yes, these officers no doubt had some hanging on their wall, that just whether Hitler knew about it or not, that's another story. But yeah, definitely a fascinating part of international history.
And I'm talking to Lee Capel about art in the Third Reich, and you're listening to Kaleidoscope on 5MBS. And as you were explaining that, I was wondering, when the Nazi officers went to places like Paris or wherever they went and raided the art of that country, had they been instructed not to bring, say, Impressionist paintings back, or did they just take what they thought they'd like to take?
Basically, they just decided what they liked or they saw value in, and they would just cherry pick, basically. And especially in different countries, like in France particularly, they had a venue called the Jeu de Paume, which was a museum, a very important museum. And basically they used to use that as the headquarters for all the art that was brought in from Jewish collections or collections throughout France. And Goering used to go in there regularly and cherry pick artworks that he liked. And there were situations where Goering would go in there and pick for Hitler, because obviously Hitler was quite busy at that period. So he would go in and pick out Vermeers and that. And his taste was actually quite influenced by what Hitler was getting. For example, when he found a Vermeer, I believe it was in Poland, and he gave it as a gift to Hitler. I think it was the astronomer, actually, one of the very important Vermeer paintings. He got so entranced by this artist that he decided to go get one for himself. And he was actually able to locate one in the Netherlands, and that's a fascinating story we'll talk about in the lecture. Quite amusing, and it created a bit of folklore in its own right, because it was just an interesting background of what happened. But yeah, so they're in these depositories of art, and they weren't just in museums, they were hidden inside mountains. They were hidden inside tunnels and salt mines. So these officers would go in and choose what they liked and took them away, and thankfully most of that was recovered.
Now, Lee, was Hitler a little bit like Stalin, or was Stalin a little bit like Hitler, in the way that Stalin more or less told artists and musicians and writers what they were supposed to produce, or was he not quite so domineering, except in the field of art?
Look, I think Stalin was the next level of control, where he was actually basically telling them exactly what to do. It was funny, the other day I was actually watching that brilliant movie, The Death of Stalin. And
oh, yes,
you can
yes.
just see how much control that he had over society, whereas Hitler was a little different, I believe. I think Hitler would pick what he liked and destroy what he didn't like, really, in terms of creation. He did influence several contemporary artists at the time to paint in a very specific way, and that way was based upon classical art being influenced by ancient Greek and Roman cultures and ancient art, where gods are depicted as humans. And I think that's the way he wanted that depiction to come across, was that men are gods, and in Nazi rhetoric, men are gods, and they fit a very specific look. You know, the word is Aryan, which is a very dirty word now, but it's white, blue-eyed, tall, blonde, you know, that look. So I believe that in influencing people to paint it that way, he was able to get a core of artists to do that. Yeah, definitely. But in essence, he was still cherry-picking, like I mentioned before, artists he liked from the past that fitted that description unintentionally, you know? So some of the artworks he was getting from the 19th century sort of fitted that, you know, Western look, but also influenced by Greek and Roman ancient cultures.
And did the German army have war artists like the Allies had, who went in and painted soldiers at war?
Yes, they did. And I have a couple of artworks by artists that were war artists during the time. I think, you know, coming from an Australian background, like, we were very, very organised when it came to war artists. We had many, many Australian war artists that were official war artists. Germany had a similar situation, and not only in the First and Second World War, but predating that. And I've got a few artworks I'll be using as examples, and I've got one particular artwork of a Nazi officer that was done during World War II by an official war artist from Germany, who actually was a repurposed German expressionist. And a lot of artists actually were repurposed during that time. They were accepted for their skill, provided they changed their style to suit the Reich. And the best example of that was the propaganda posters. Most of the propaganda posters that the Nazi regime used were designed by Bauhaus designers and artists. And Bauhaus was, you know, the peak of modernism and modern art at the time, and architecture and design. And yet these artists were doing artworks for Hitler and the regime purely because they were forced to. But Hitler, I think, did that because he realised the popularity of modern contemporary art, which it was at the time, with the public, and influencing them to believe, to be against minorities like the Jewish. And so that's an interesting way that Hitler was able to utilise degenerate artists that he considered degenerate artists for the cause. So when it came to war artists, a lot of them were German expressionists or artists that really couldn't work otherwise. So, yeah, I'll be talking a lot about those sorts of artists and how it worked, really.
And did they switch back after the war to paint the way they wanted to do it?
Yes, so the ones that didn't disappear completely, you know, overseas, once the war had finished, the pressure had alleviated. But obviously, if they were German, they had to live with this whole horrific event and the blame game. But a lot of the artists were able to continue, like Nolde, who I mentioned before, he was able to continue painting. I think he switched back to oils. Yeah, it was something that even the artists that relocated to America, some of them came back, some of them stayed, and the war artists just reverted back to their usual art. But yeah, the whole art climate in the industry changed completely after World War II, because I think everyone had to recalibrate and also recover all this important art. And that obviously changed the value. So all these degenerate artists, not immediately, but they grew in popularity. And I'll be talking about the great degenerate Entartetenkunst, is what it was called, a degenerate art exhibition, and how popular that was during the war, and then how those artworks, some of them were destroyed, some of them survived, and how those artists grew in popularity post-war, and vice versa for the artists that Hitler supported.
We're running out of time, but just one last question. I presume you'll be bringing images of these. Can you bring any of the actual paintings?
Well, in previous lectures, I have used actual physical props, which has been fantastic, because after the lecture, people can come up and view the works. But logistically, because I'm travelling on the plane down to Adelaide via Perth, I will be, probably not, but I'll have very good images on my presentation. And if anyone would like to look further and visit me in Sydney, I can show them the original works.
Excellent.
Which are fantastic, full of history.
You wouldn't want to risk taking them on the plane because they might get lost.
That's not the first time a lot of these paintings were lost, you know.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for talking to us. I'll give the details in a minute about where you are and when people can hear you and how they can get in touch. But thank you for talking to Kaleidoscope. But what I think is probably news to a lot of people, unless they're really into the art movement. So that's something of great interest. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye. Lee Capel will be speaking on the 12th of October at 10:30am in St Andrew's Church, 43 Church Terrace, Walkerville, and again at 7:30pm in the Burnside Uniting Church, that's 384 Portrush Road, Tusmore. And there's supper following that evening talk, and I think there's usually morning tea after the morning one. You'd be unlucky to miss out on that. You can book for these talks through Margaret Stableford, and her phone number is 0407 070 722, or you can email her at mstableford1@bigpond.com, and that's Stableford just like it sounds. And I'll give that phone number again at the very end of the program, so if you've missed it and you want to ring her up, you can be ready with your pencil, piece of paper or your phone, all ready to record it.